"You're built strangely for a prey species," said Varnak, tilting his narrow green head and tapping a long digit against his translator. "Shorter limbs, high muscle density, curious?" Rylan nodded once. "Thanks, I think." It was the second week of the Interstellar Student Exchange Program on the Dressari learning vessel Tallene 4, and Rylan had already been the center of more than one awkward conversation. He had agreed to join the program representing Earth, not anticipating the level of daily scrutiny he'd face. "Your kind does not possess bio-armor, venom glands, or regenerative tissue," Varnak continued, staring at Rylan's arm. "Yet you persist in hostile environments, statistically improbable." Rylan scratched his head. "We're good at pushing through stuff, adapt and survive, I guess." That sparked interest. Jerix, a student from the rocky moon of Krell, leaned forward. "You claim to adapt quickly. Would you wrestle me to demonstrate?" Rylan blinked. "Wrestle you? It is an academic challenge," Varnak added. "Nothing lethal. We study technique and physical limits." "It is a common comparative exercise." "I'm not a trained fighter," Rylan said. "All the better," Jerix said. "Raw data is more valuable." Rylan hesitated. He wasn't keen on turning himself into a lab experiment, but declining would probably only encourage more analysis. "Fine. But no claws, spines, or weird neurotoxins." "I agree," Jerix said, clicking his thorax. "No bioweapons, closed environment rules." The wrestling match was scheduled for the next day in the physical simulation chamber. Rylan showed up wearing borrowed athletic gear, still unsure what exactly passed for friendly wrestling here. Jerix was nearly 7 feet tall, all segmented muscle and jointed limbs. "You may initiate," Jerix said. Rylan took a breath and lunged low, trying to get leverage around what passed for Jerix's waist. It was like trying to tackle a refrigerator made of cables and rubber. Jerix reacted fast, twisting and flipping Rylan onto his back with a sound that echoed across the chamber. Rylan groaned, air punched from his lungs. "You are not incapacitated?" Jerix asked. "Nope," Rylan rasped, rolling to his knees. "Still here." He dove again, this time catching Jerix's middle and pushing with everything he had. Jerix stumbled back a few steps. "Fascinating," Varnak muttered from the sidelines, taking notes. Rylan managed to trip Jerix, sending both of them crashing down. But Jerix's elbow slammed against Rylan's ribs in the fall. There was a sharp pop. Rylan gasped. "Something's wrong left side," the chamber supervisor, a small floating being named Kilo, buzzed over. "Cease, medical emergency declared." Rylan was cradling his side, sweat breaking out across his forehead. "I think a rib's broken," he said, his voice thin. Kilo's voice remained calm. "Confirmed. Human skeletal structure compromised. Emergency med unit en route." Jerix stood back, limbs twitching. "You did not tap out. I applied considerable pressure." "I didn't know the rules," Rylan said through clenched teeth. Less than 10 minutes later, a medical crew arrived. They wore sealed suits, standard procedure for treating interspecies injuries. Rylan was placed on a hover stretcher. "Vitals are stable," said one of the medics. "He's in pain but conscious. We'll confirm internal damage with imaging." Rylan was moved to the medbay. A scanner hovered over his chest, displaying cracked ribs and a partially collapsed lung. "Rylan, you'll need to remain under observation," the attending physician, Dr. Hasek, said. "You've got 2 fractured ribs and a minor pneumothorax. We'll insert a small chest tube to relieve pressure." "You'll be grounded for at least a week." "A week?" Rylan asked, trying not to move too much. "You're lucky it wasn't worse," Hasek said. "There was no spinal damage and the lung should reinflate with standard treatment." 3 hours later, Rylan lay quietly in the medbay, a tube taped to his chest and a dull ache radiating from his side. Varnak entered, oddly subdued. "I reviewed the footage. You continued after injury. That is unusual." "I didn't want to quit," Rylan said. "You should have." "It was not weakness." "I know that now," he muttered. Jerix followed, standing awkwardly near the foot of the bed. "I apologize. I did not anticipate your tolerance for injury. You should not have accepted." I probably shouldn't have, Rylan said, but I thought I'd be fine. You demonstrated something I do not understand, Jarek said. You willingly endured damage. For what purpose? Rylan stared at the ceiling. Because I wanted to see if I could do it, even if it hurt. Jarek said nothing, just tilted his head and blinked. The medbay lights dimmed slightly for rest cycle. Rylan closed his eyes, pain still sharp but dulled by the meds. He didn't feel triumphant, just exhausted. And the next day he learned that Jarek had requested another match, just not with him. 3 days passed before Rylan could sit up without his vision tunneling. The chest tube had been removed 12 hours earlier, and the painkillers were dialed down to allow his body to recalibrate. The medical wing of Tallene 4 was quiet during the early rest cycle lights, humming in low amber. Distant clicks of diagnostic machines echoing like slow raindrops. He was propped against a molded recliner, sipping warm nutrient broth that tasted like someone had whispered the word chicken into a vat of beige paste. He was bored, sore, and not particularly interested in making eye contact with any of the passing staff. That changed when the door hissed open and a familiar pair of elongated legs stepped in. Rylan, said Varnak, your chart indicates you are no longer in acute distress. I wouldn't throw a party yet, he muttered. But yeah, I'm upright. Varnak approached slowly, his translucent eye shields flicking upward. The incident has generated considerable discourse among the peer cohort. Some interpret your refusal to yield as evidence of species-specific behavioral extremity. Thanks, Rylan said, setting the broth aside. Are you here to ask more questions, or? I am here to observe the aftermath. Jarek has submitted a formal behavior deviation report. It includes a request for philosophical arbitration. Rylan raised an eyebrow. Philosophical what? It is a method of resolving cognitive dissonance through structured debate. Jarek believes your behavior contradicts known survival logic. He seeks resolution. Rylan blinked. He wants to argue about why I didn't quit, not argue, discern. He has invited witnesses. Oh, fantastic, Rylan muttered. How many are we talking? 17, Varnak replied. Before Rylan could decide whether to laugh or groan, the door slid open again. This time, it was not a student but Dr. Hasek, the station physician. Her mouth was a thin line as she scanned Rylan's vitals from the display embedded in the wall. You're stable enough to leave the medbay for 1 hour maximum, she said. If you overexert, you'll be back here under sedation. Understood, loud and clear, Rylan said. 10 minutes later, he was escorted still in a loose tunic and med slippers into an amphitheater chamber that looked far too grand for an argument about personal choices. The seats were tiered in concentric rings, filled with students from at least 9 different species. Some floated, others perched on multi-jointed limbs or sat coiled in temperature-controlled cushions. Jarek stood at the center, his carapace polished and antennae angled forward. A broad screen behind him displayed a still image of Rylan mid-fall from their match, his face contorted, elbow bent under impact. Rylan muttered, "That's flattering." Jarek turned. "Thank you for attending." "I have questions." "You always do," Rylan said, stepping onto the central platform with a wince. Jarek launched immediately. "You sustained bodily compromise early in the contest. You possessed no reasonable path to victory. Why continue?" "It's not always about winning," Rylan said. "Sometimes it's about seeing how far you can go," Jarek paused. "But your species is not physiologically equipped for high-impact endurance. You were aware your structure was failing." "Yeah. I felt every second of it. And yet you did not issue a surrender signal." "I didn't know how," Rylan said. "You never told me the rules." A murmur spread through the crowd. One of the observers, a crystalline being with rotating eye clusters, buzzed a question. "Would you have stopped if the pain were greater?" "I don't know," Rylan admitted. "Probably not right away." Jarek turned to the audience. "This is illogical behavior. Pain indicates damage. Damage reduces survival probability. Why persist in a failed scenario?" Rylan looked at him. Because sometimes quitting feels worse than hurting. That caused a silence. Another student, glossy-skinned and coiled like a ribbon, uncoiled her form slightly. Is that a cultural imperative or a personal defect? Neither, Rylan said. It's just how we're wired, some of us anyway. We don't like giving up, even when it's stupid. Jerix considered this. You willingly prioritized an abstract principle over biological preservation. Yeah, Rylan said. You could say that, the crystalline being rotated its lenses. Fascinating. Does your species punish those who withdraw? No, but we praise the ones who grind through. Jerix took a half step closer. Is this why so many of your species engage in hazardous recreation, climbing, diving, combustion racing? Probably, Rylan said. We call it pushing limits. A new student bipedal with a long neck and iridescent scales raised a hand. What is the purpose of seeking limits that may kill you? Because if you don't try, you never know where the edge is. Jerix's mandibles clicked softly. You are not engineered for resilience, yet you pursue it. That's exactly why we pursue it. The amphitheater fell quiet again. A few students jotted notes, others simply stared. No one laughed, no one scoffed. Jerix turned toward the screen and deactivated the image. I cannot process this behavior using standard threat response frameworks. That's fair, Rylan said. We don't always make sense to ourselves either. A low laugh, dry and brief, came from the ribbon-like student. That may be the most human sentence I've heard yet, Doctor. Hasek appeared at the doorway then, tapping her calm. Time's up, she said. 1 hour. Rylan nodded and turned to leave, every step a reminder of cartilage, bruising, and bone. Just before he reached the exit, Jerix spoke again. I do not understand your reasoning, he said. But I acknowledge it exists. That's all I can ask, Rylan said. As the door closed behind him, the audience remained in hushed discourse. The human had not triumphed. He had not overpowered or outsmarted. But he had endured, and that, on this vessel where logic reigned supreme, was something no one had quite known how to categorize. Except now, they had to. 4 hours after the debate, Rylan was back in the medbay, half draped in a thermal blanket, watching an unfamiliar alien documentary about fungal colonies that could mimic gravitational fields. He wasn't really following it. He kept thinking about the way Jerix had said, I acknowledge it exists, as if that settled something, and yet it clearly hadn't. The match and what came after had set something in motion among the other exchange students. The kind of something that made Rylan's stomach twist with the same dread as a teacher flipping to the next slide and saying, Now, let's discuss this in groups. The documentary dimmed. A soft chime rang over the comm panel, followed by Dr. Hasek's voice. You're being released from observation. A mobility assistant will guide you back to your assigned quarters. No unsupervised physical activity for 72 hours. Copy that, Rylan said, already swinging his legs off the recliner with a wince. He hadn't made it 20 feet down the corridor before he saw Varnak standing beside the lift, his elongated frame still as a statue. You're cleared, Varnak said without preamble. I have a question. Of course you do, Rylan muttered, leaning against the wall. Do humans initiate damage upon themselves intentionally? Rylan blinked. What? No, not like for fun, clarify. Some people do extreme stuff, yeah, but usually there's a reason, purpose, reward, challenge, something worth the risk. Varnak's eyes narrowed. You said previously that you continued because quitting felt worse than pain. Is that common? Depends who you ask, Rylan said. Some of us are like that. Others probably would have tapped out the second things started cracking. Varnak turned toward the lift doors. Jerix has scheduled another physical encounter, not with you, with Grosh. Rylan straightened. Grosh with the armor plating? Yes, Jerix seeks to compare tolerance levels. Grosh has agreed. The match begins in 20 minutes. Rylan paused. Why are you telling me? Varnak tilted his head. I am uncertain. Perhaps I wish to see if the result changes your understanding. By the time Rylan reached the observation deck overlooking the kinetic chamber, the room was already filling with students. Grosh, a quadruped with slate-gray exoskin and a neck as thick as Rylan's torso, was stomping in place to loosen his joints. Jarek stood opposite him, antennae low, limbs at the ready. The match began with no ceremony. Grosh charged, and Jarek responded with a fluid pivot that sent both of them tumbling. The chamber floor shuddered. Grosh recovered first, slamming into Jarek's midsection and pinning him with a weight advantage Rylan knew he himself had never possessed. The bout lasted less than 5 minutes. When Grosh finally let up and backed off, Jarek rolled over, clicking something under his breath. A med drone hovered in, scanned him, and declared no fractures, no internal damage. Jarek stood. "I yield." Gasps rippled through the crowd, not at the loss but at the admission. Rylan exhaled, tension escaping his shoulders. Grosh lumbered off the mat, grumbling something indistinct. Jarek remained standing, arms loose at his sides, not injured but visibly unsettled. Hours later, Rylan found himself in the hydroponics chamber, watching a nutrient mist drift over rows of alien ferns. Jarek approached silently, eyes unreadable. "You saw." "I did," Rylan said. "I reached my threshold," Jarek said. "I did not anticipate how quickly it would arrive." Rylan nodded slowly. "You made the right call." "I did not wish to. Neither did I. That's kind of the point." Jarek sat beside one of the wide tubs, mandibles twitching. "You are not stronger than Grosh. Your musculature is inferior. Yet you endured longer under greater distress." "Yeah," Rylan said. "I've been thinking about that. I don't think it's about strength or even about pain. It's about what we expect from ourselves." Jarek didn't respond. Rylan turned to him. "You tapped because you believed it was time to stop." "I didn't because I believed I shouldn't stop, even when I wanted to. Different expectations, that's all." Jarek tilted his head. "My expectations were calibrated against known limits. Yours were not." "Maybe not," Rylan said. "Maybe mine were just fuzzy fluid." There was a pause. "I do not know if I could endure as you did," Jarek said. "I don't think that's something anyone can know until it's tested." Jarek stood. "Then perhaps I should not have initiated the challenge without understanding that." Rylan looked up. "You regret it." "I am uncertain." "I regret the injury. I do not regret the outcome." The door to the hydroponics chamber opened again, and a trio of students filtered in, their low voices trailing off when they noticed Rylan. One of them, a tall, feathered being named Elath, nodded at him in passing. Rylan gave a small wave and turned back to the misting plants. "I think," Jarek said, "that your presence here will result in recalibration across several models." "I'm not a model," Rylan said. "Just a guy who got his ribs cracked." Jarek regarded him for a long moment. "That may be why it matters." He departed without another word. Later that evening, Rylan sat on the floor of his quarters, still stiff but able to breathe without flinching. He pulled up the student message logs on his terminal, watching the chatter scroll past. Most of it was informal dialects, but one phrase kept repeating in translation: threshold variance. Apparently, his choice not to quit had introduced a concept that didn't cleanly fit within the existing frameworks of endurance or logic. It was being debated, diagrammed, and in some cases challenged. He shook his head and shut off the screen. A chime sounded at his door. "Come in," he said, unsure who to expect. This time it was Elath. "I was informed you are not accepting further matches," she said. "Yeah." "Doctor's orders." "I am not here to challenge you. I am here to ask, if you had the option to redo the event, would you?" Rylan considered it. "I'd probably ask more questions first, but yeah, I think I would." Elath's feathers tightened slightly. "You do not fear the pain. I fear it. I just don't let that decide everything." She studied him for a beat longer and then nodded. "We lack a term for that approach. It is not bravery, not quite stubbornness. It is something else." "I don't have a name for it either," Rylan said. When she left, he sat in silence, listening to the low hum of the ship. He wasn't sure what he had started, but he knew it wasn't over. 3 days later, at precisely the 6th rest cycle interval, Rylan was summoned to the Central Forum Hall. He hadn't been there since the philosophical arbitration. And the last time he'd been on that platform, his ribs were still grinding like broken gears. Now he could breathe without flinching, though the occasional twinge reminded him that healing wasn't finished. The forum doors slid open with their usual whisper, revealing a smaller gathering than before. No packed amphitheater, this time just 8 students seated in a loose half-circle. A few had their neural recorders calibrated and ready, but no one was talking. Rylan stepped in, unsure if he was early or simply the last invited. At the center stood a tall figure with branching antennae, Yikesh, a student from the arboreal colonies of Ditha. Her limbs were elongated and jointless, moving with a slow, deliberate fluidity. "You are punctual," she said, her voice layered through a translator that gave it a dry, papery texture. "Wasn't sure if this was a meeting or an ambush," Rylan said, glancing around. "No ambush, observation, controlled setting. We intend to replicate the conditions under which your endurance was tested." Rylan frowned. "You want to run another match, not a match," said a smaller student Jiri from the aquatic rings of Sorn. "A simulation, you will not be struck." Rylan didn't move. "You're going to simulate pain, correct," said Yikesh. "We have constructed a neural feedback environment calibrated to induce stress responses akin to injury. No physical harm, only the sensation." Rylan folded his arms. "And what exactly are you expecting to learn?" "We want to understand the threshold, the point at which you decide to stop," Jiri said. "If there is such a point." "I already told you I didn't know where it was," Rylan muttered. "Precisely why we wish to observe it," Yikesh said. "But you will have full control. You may disengage at any time." Rylan hesitated. This wasn't like before. It wasn't about pride or proving something. It was a setup, sterile and contained, but it still turned his stomach. "I'll do it," he said. "But not alone." Yikesh blinked. "Clarify? I want one of you in there with me, someone who doesn't understand why I didn't quit." The group went quiet. Then a voice from the far edge of the room spoke up. "I volunteer." It was Kesh, a student from a high-gravity world whose torso was covered in flexible ceramic scales and whose voice carried a low, churning resonance. "I don't understand your behavior. I would like to." Yikesh inclined her head. "Accepted." "The simulation will begin in 20 minutes. The chamber they entered wasn't large, just a circular space with padded flooring and an array of neural interfaces lining the walls. Rylan and Kesh were guided to separate seats, where soft bands were affixed to their temples and wrists. "You will experience escalating discomfort," intoned a technician. "The system will synchronize your responses for comparative analysis. You may exit at any moment by vocal command." "Understood," Kesh said. Rylan just nodded. The lights dimmed. At first there was nothing. Then a faint pressure at the base of Rylan's spine, like someone leaning on him with a bony elbow. It increased steadily, spreading through his lower back and up toward his ribs. Across from him, Kesh shifted slightly. "Level 1, said the technician. The sensation turned sharp, like the aftermath of a fall onto concrete. Rylan's breath caught. He glanced at Kesh, who was still, but his eyes had narrowed. "Level 2. Now it was a clamp around his chest, tight and uneven. He could feel each simulated heartbeat pressing against something stiff and wrong. His palms were slick. "Level 3. A flash of heat burst behind his ribs, not real, but real enough. Rylan grit his teeth. Kesh's chest was rising faster now. "Level 4. It was the elbow again, the one that had cracked his ribs days ago, a ghost version of it, but accurate enough to make his stomach twist. "Level 5. Kesh let out a noise, not a word, more like a grunt of surprise. His scales rippled with tension. "Level 6. Rylan's hands were clenched. His jaw ached from how tightly he was holding it. He wanted to say stop, but he didn't. He looked at Kesh again. The scales on his arms were pulsing, shifting color along their edges. His mouth opened slightly. "Cease." The room brightened. The pressure vanished. Kesh was breathing hard, pupils dilated. He looked at Rylan, eyes unblinking. "You continued," he said. "Why?" Rylan rubbed his eyes. "Because I knew it wasn't real, but the pain was." Yeah, but I knew it would end, that's the difference. Kesh tilted his head. You endured longer despite the same input. I wasn't trying to beat you, I just wanted to see what you'd do. Kesh looked down at his hands. I do not believe I would have lasted longer. You probably could have, Rylan said. But maybe you didn't see the point. Later, outside the chamber, Yikesh approached him. The data confirms your response pattern deviates from standard projections. Your persistence did not correlate with perceived threat or reward. I wasn't thinking about projection models, Rylan said. I was thinking about whether I could handle the next minute, that's all. What determines your decision to continue? It's not a decision, he said. It's just momentum. You go one more step than another. You don't stop to ask if it's smart until it's over. Jiri tilted her head. And if it never ends, then maybe you drop, but at least you know you tried. The group dispersed without ceremony. No applause, no verdicts, just quiet processing. An hour later, back in his quarters, Rylan sat at the edge of his bunk, arms resting on his knees. There was no message on his console, no invitation, no new challenge, but for the first time he felt a shift not in how they saw him, but in how they saw the thing inside him. The drive not to quit, the stubborn, reckless insistence that pain could be outlasted, even when it made no sense. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't fear, it was curiosity, and that, he thought, might be the most dangerous thing of all. 6 hours after the simulation, Rylan was still wide awake. He lay on his bunk, one arm over his eyes, trying to will his brain to stop rehashing every second of the test. Even though it hadn't been real pain, not entirely, he could still feel it echoing in his chest like a memory with teeth. There was a strange numbness in knowing he'd sat through it while Kesh had bowed out, not because he'd bested anyone, but because he hadn't known how to recognize the line between resilience and foolishness. A tone sounded at the door, not the usual chime of an announcement. A knock. Yeah, he called. The door slid open, revealing Trennick thin, tall, and always looking like he was 2 steps ahead of everyone else in a chess game only he understood. His eyes were flickering in a color Rylan hadn't seen before, like metal cooling. You're not sleeping, Trennick said. Impressive diagnosis, Rylan muttered, sitting up. You're scheduled for a systems orientation in 10 hours. I calculated a 68% probability you'd be unable to rest. Rylan rubbed his face. Did you come to read my vitals or tell me something? I have a theory, Trennick said, stepping inside without waiting, but I need to test it conversationally. Rylan gestured vaguely. Go ahead. My pain threshold is apparently a hot topic. That's tangential, Trennick said. I'm trying to understand the underlying mechanism. Not your reaction to pain, but your refusal to disengage when pain becomes the dominant input. It suggests a feedback interruption. It suggests I'm stubborn. No, Trennick said. It suggests a neurological override that doesn't align with standard reward avoidance models. You weren't continuing for victory. You weren't continuing out of fear. And you were fully aware the sensation could escalate. I didn't have a plan, if that's what you're asking. Trennick crouched beside the bunk, folding his long limbs with unsettling grace. That's what I'm trying to reach, the absence of a plan. Your species is not unique in endurance. But most species endure for a goal. You seem to endure without one. Rylan leaned back against the wall. I just didn't want to be the first to quit. That is a goal, Trennick said. A social one, but not a survival one. That's what makes it interesting. Rylan exhaled sharply through his nose. Are you asking if I did it because of peer pressure? I'm asking what you tell yourself when everything in your body is screaming to stop, but you don't. What sentence floats to the front of your mind? Rylan stared at the ceiling. Just keep going. Trennick tilted his head. That's it. That's it. He stood, stretching his arms overhead. I'm not sure why that's so fascinating to you. Because it's a recursive command, Trennick said. It offers no endpoint, no condition for cessation, just a loop. That's kind of how we're built, Rylan said. We loop. We try again even when it doesn't make sense. Trennick paused on his way to the door. That is a dangerous design. Tell me about it. 3 hours later, Rylan was in the central atrium, sipping something warm and bitter from a nutrient dispenser when two younger students approached him. They moved cautiously, like they hadn't decided whether he was approachable or radioactive. The one on the left, pale-skinned with 4 thin arms, spoke first. "Is it true you refuse to disengage during simulated threshold spikes?" "Yeah," Rylan said, not looking up. "That's true." "Why?" asked the other, who was smaller and had a smooth, featureless face that rippled when it spoke. "Because I didn't want to stop," Rylan said. The two looked at each other, then back at him. "You were not forced?" "No." "Then what benefit did you expect?" "I didn't." They stood there, silent. Rylan finally looked up and met their eyes. "Look," he said, "I get that it's weird. I don't think it's smart, and I'm not saying anyone should do it. I just didn't want to stop when it got hard, that's all." The smaller one's skin rippled again. "We were told humans have unpredictable patterns. We assumed that meant erratic aggression or poor control, but this is different." The taller one nodded. "It is not aggression. It is silent resistance." "That makes it harder to understand," the smaller student added. "There's no signal." "We're bad at signals," Rylan said. "We don't always show what's going on. Sometimes we don't even know ourselves." They left without another word. By the time the system orientation started, Rylan had skipped a full sleep cycle. He arrived 10 minutes late, hair still damp from a rushed sonic shower. The instructor and artificial intelligence core installed in a mobile drone paused mid-sentence as he entered. "You are delayed." "Yeah," Rylan said. "Sorry, you are also under rest violation. Your neural patterns indicate elevated stress." "I'm fine." "You are not," Rylan sighed. "Can we just get through the orientation?" The drone hovered for a long moment, then resumed. Halfway through the presentation, Rylan noticed Jarek sitting at the edge of the room, not participating, just watching. Their eyes met briefly, but Jarek's didn't speak. Afterward, as students filed out, Jarek's approached. "I did not observe the simulation in real time," he said. "I reviewed it afterward," Rylan nodded. "Not much to see." "Incorrect," Jarek said. "There was a moment when you appeared to be on the verge of termination command. You inhaled, leaned forward, then continued." "I remember." "What changed in that moment?" "I thought about stopping," Rylan said. "Then I didn't." "That is not a valid explanation. It's the only one I've got." Jarek stood very still, then said, "Grosh has requested a rematch." Rylan blinked. "With me?" "No, with me." Rylan crossed his arms. "You think you'll go longer this time?" "I do not know. But I want to find out if my threshold is fixed, or if it can adapt." Rylan watched him go. It wasn't about strength anymore. It was about the idea that maybe, just maybe, you could choose to keep going, not because it was smart or safe, but because the alternative felt worse. And now, others were starting to wonder if they could try it too. 3 full rotations, 4 standard Earth days after the simulation, things had stopped being strange and started being structured. The incident had moved from curiosity to curriculum. Not officially, but enough that Rylan found himself scheduled for a moderated dialogue session in one of the smaller exchange halls, this time with no sensors, drones, or neural calibrators. Just chairs and words. He showed up early, not out of enthusiasm, but because he didn't want to walk in late and be watched like a test animal again. Waiting inside were 6 students from different species, all seated in a loose arc around a single low table. They weren't the usual observers. These were the ones who had stayed quiet through the whole ordeal, those who hadn't asked for matches, simulations, or debates. Which made it weirder. A quiet figure with skin like folded parchment stood up when he entered. She gestured to an empty seat beside her. "I didn't catch your name," Rylan said as he sat. "Farrell," she replied. "We're not here to analyze you." "That's a relief," Rylan muttered. "We're here because we think we might have missed something." Rylan leaned back. "Missed what exactly?" Farrell looked around at the others before answering. "It's not about pain or even endurance. It's about the choice to keep suffering when nothing external requires it." "I didn't think it was philosophy," Rylan said. "It just felt like stubbornness." "It's not stubbornness." said a short, broad being across the circle. His name was Alton, and Rylan remembered him from the systems engineering group. Stubbornness is when you refuse to change, but you weren't resisting change, you were walking into it. I didn't know what else to do. Exactly, Alton said. And that's what we don't have a framework for. Farrell leaned forward slightly. We've been taught that discomfort equals retreat, that when a system detects failure, it compensates or disengages. But you didn't disengage. You didn't compensate. You just kept going without a directive. That's what we're trying to understand. Rylan rubbed his temple. So what do you want from me? A manual? No, said a voice near the back. It belonged to Narine, a being from the floating settlements of Trossi. She had a voice like distant wind. We want to ask something very simple. Go ahead. Were you afraid? Rylan blinked. Of what? Of what might happen if you stopped, he hesitated. I guess I was more afraid of what it would say about me if I didn't try. Farrell nodded once. That's the part no one modeled. Rylan exhaled. Is this going to be another round of questions I can't answer? No, Alton said. It's the last one. We're not instructors, we're your peers. We just didn't know how much that meant until now. Farrell stood. You've changed how some of us measure effort. Not through strategy, but by doing nothing more than enduring when we would have calculated withdrawal. I didn't mean to change anything, Rylan said. That's why it changed, Narine replied. The room stayed quiet for a while after they left, even though the lights stayed on. Rylan remained seated, unsure what to make of the sudden lack of tension. He wasn't being challenged, interrogated, or dissected. They just wanted to understand, and now they felt like they did. He couldn't explain why that left him more unsettled than all the simulations combined. 2 hours later, he was back in the central training chamber, not to fight, not to test, but to move. Dr. Hasek had cleared him for light kinetic activity, and he needed to feel like his body still belonged to him. He ran laps along the perimeter, slow at first, careful not to aggravate the healing ribs. The pain was mostly gone, but a few deep breaths still carried a whisper of resistance. By the 4th lap, he was joined by Grosh. The huge creature thudded into pace beside him without a word. They ran side by side for a few minutes before Grosh spoke. I lost to Jerix. Rylan didn't slow. Did you expect to win? No, but I expected to last longer. You disappointed? Not exactly. They ran another lap in silence. He asked me afterward, Grosh said, why I stopped. What you tell him, I said, because I was done. Fair, Grosh looked over. He asked me if that was weakness. I said no. What did he say? He said he didn't know anymore. Rylan let out a breath. Sounds familiar, Grosh grunted. I think that's the point. We don't know anymore, not what's strength, not what's failure. Is that a bad thing? No, Grosh said. It means we're learning. They finished another lap. Grosh slowed first, stopping near the hydration panel. Rylan kept going for one more circuit, then joined him. I heard your endurance was catalogued, Grosh said, tapping the panel for a mineral drink. I didn't authorize that. No one cares. You're a reference point now. Rylan looked at the ceiling. That's not what I came here for. Grosh handed him a drink. It never is. Later that night, Rylan sat alone in the viewing deck, watching the distant scatter of stars. The ship's slow drift made the constellations shift imperceptibly, like they were stretching toward something just out of reach. The door behind him opened softly. Jerix stepped out, moving with less stiffness than before. I have no more matches scheduled, he said, taking a break. I'm finished. Rylan nodded. You find what you were looking for? No, but I found something else. Jerix sat beside him, antennae angled slightly upward. I no longer believe that pain is purely a warning. What do you think it is? A boundary, but not all boundaries are meant to hold. They sat in silence, watching the stars. I reviewed your data one last time, Jerix said. You didn't endure because you were built for it. You endured because you refused to accept that the experience had to define you. Rylan smiled faintly. You make it sound noble. It is not noble, it is terrifying, and I think that's why it matters. The viewing deck dimmed as the ship entered rest cycle. Neither of them moved. And for the first time since the match, Rylan felt no need to explain himself. There was nothing left to prove, no more questions to answer, no more matches to refuse. He had nothing more to endure, and for once, that was enough.